When we think about, and specifically, we talk about sex, and orgasming, there's a couple of things that are really important to consider here. One is that you are essentially bathing your brain in all of these neurochemicals that are so positive for you.
Welcome to this week's Escape Your Limits podcast. Our guest today is a renowned expert on neuroscience, metabolism, hormones, and body composition. She has helped thousands of people lose weight naturally by understanding and regulating their hormones with a signature program, the Estima Diet. In this episode, we learn how to maximize and optimize your health span, including the key components of a diet that not only works, but is one you can stick to. Also, how to get your brain so it works for you instead of against you, and how the right fitness and recovery plan can supercharge your sex life. So please welcome the author of the #1 best-selling book, The Betty Body, Dr. Stephanie Estima, to the Escape Your Limits podcast. So Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a subject, I originally came across you. I think you was doing some stuff with the guys at Bulletproof. I'm not sure whether was it a conference that you did?
I was speaking on Dave's, I was on his podcast.
Right. Okay. And I think you did. I saw a YouTube video as well where it was there was some conference. I thought it was.
Oh, you know what? You're right. No, I did actually. Thank you. Yeah, I did. I interviewed Dave at a Archangel conference, which was maybe a couple of years ago now. So yeah, him and Dr. Mark Hyman and JJ Virgin.
Yeah, so that's how I came across you, and I started to, my wife and I were sort of quite interested in the subject, and we had a number of conversations about it. So I'm really excited about this, and we got the book, and I was, we interview a lot of people, and I read a lot of books, and some of the books are quite sort of, they're good, but it quite surface. You don't go too deep, and you kind of you come away from the book and you feel as though you've learned something, but you could have condensed it into a few pages. Whereas your book, I felt it was quite meaty.
Thank you.
Congratulations on that. What was the motivation for you to put that together?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me. It's just a thrill to be here, and thank you for that praise. Anytime I receive feedback like that on the book from fellow colleagues, of course, you always want to hear great things about your book from the people that it's impacting, but it also means something really special from, people who really know the science and can appreciate what you've put together. So thank you. So I would say that, the impetus for this book was really born out of a few things. One was my own personal struggles with my menstrual cycle and my reproductive cycle. And then the second was seeing those patterns mimicked in my patient population when I had a brick and mortar practice. So my own struggles, I used to, and I'm very motivated, very achievement oriented person. So, went through my university years at, pursuing neuroscience and psychology. Those are my two majors, and then went on to complete a professional degree as a doctor of chiropractic. So very, very much I want all the A's. I want I want to achieve all the things, all the accolades, all the letters behind my name, that kind of thing. And in order to do that, and maybe I shouldn't say in order to do that, but my own path was that I ignored a lot of my body. So when I was tired, I wouldn't rest. I would say, I need to get an A+ on this upcoming whatever. So I would push myself beyond the physical limits of my matter, to the point where I started having some of these compensatory patterns. They showed up as burnout. They showed up as erratic and very painful, pre-menstrual syndrome. And then on my period, very, very painful, a lot of cramping, still not listening to that, over medicating to silence the symptoms my body was trying to tell me. So that was a whole, multi-decade journey. And then I also noticed a lot of similar patterns being reproduced in my female population in practice. So worked had clinic for many, many years in downtown Toronto, Canada. So, really big city, the biggest city in Canada, working in the downtown core, lots of very similar, high achieving women and men. And my women were experiencing a lot of the same things. So, this weight loss resistance, a lot of painful periods, lots of low back pain, all these kinds of things. And when I implemented a nutrition program inside the clinic. So we did a lot of rehabilitation. We did a lot of foundational and structural work in the clinic. And then we also paired that with chemical restructuring through diet, as many of your audience members can attest to. If you are a personal trainer or you're somebody who is working on the body, if you're a body worker, it's one thing to implement exercise and rehab. It's so much more powerful when you combine that with nutrition. So put a nutrition program together and then started noticing same kind of thing. Like, men were getting really great results. They're like, "Doc, this is like, I've done this keto," it was a ketogenic program. So like, we're doing keto for 2 weeks. Like, I'm down 25 pounds. I feel great. My virility, my fertility, all this stuff. And the women who were doing the program were really struggling. So the two of those similar parallel timelines for me really called to me to look into what are some of the distinguishing factors when we're caring for our female patients or our female clients, and how can we alter some of the, what I'd call standard protocol to nuance that to female physiology. And I think, whether you're a man or a woman, when you are working with women, we are not little men, right? Even though we look smaller, like we're smaller archetypes in some ways, but we have different cycles. We have different hormonal compositions. And then that hormonal composition, of course, also ebbs and flows if you're in your, especially if you're in your reproductive years over the course of, you're very different every single day of the month. So those two things really combined were what my drive and my desire to create this book.
Yeah. You mentioned that using the example of where you were at the times and where you were, I guess your mind was overriding what your body was telling it, almost like ignoring it. And quite a few people that we speak to on the podcast talk about, when people are trying to get in shape or lose weight or anything physical, how the importance of starting with your mind. And I know one of the things that you've studied is neuro health and the brain, how that works. Now sort of seeing what you studied originally and what you're doing, what, in your experience, what part does the mind and the brain play into, your physical wellness, and how important is that?
It's a great question. I would say that it is everything. Like, you can do all the nutrition and you can, do all the exercise, but if you absolutely hate who you are and you don't have the brain mechanics to support the changes in your lifestyle, those changes are not going to be long-lived. So one of the things that, I'm really interested in longevity. I'm really interested in how we can increase our lifespan, and in doing so, increase our health span. And it's really sexy to be thinking about all the mechanisms. Like, let's talk about estrogen metabolism. Let's talk about androgen stuff. And let's talk about the HPA axis and all these different things, and hormones and endocrine stuff. But if you hate who you are, or you have these faulty thought patterns where you may be self-sabotaging and don't realize it, or you have limiting beliefs about your capacity. And, I'll say that we all have them, right? We all have that inner critic or that inner gremlin that tells us that we are not smart enough, you're not good enough, you're not capable enough, you're not pretty enough, you're not handsome enough, you don't have enough muscles, you don't have enough. There's some voice that's always telling you that you're not enough in some way. But it's our job, both as a coach, right, or as a doctor in a doctor-patient capacity, or in a personal trainer, fitness client capacity, to meet our clients where they are, to understand what some of the mental struggles that our clients are having, and then for us to be able to do our own work. Like, we also need to walk the walk, right? We need to do our own work, but to help counsel them on that way, because you can't. When we think about, embarking on a new fitness regimen, for example, or a new diet, it's really easy to be seduced by the newness of it when you're first starting, right? So like, oh, I'm going to work out 4 times a week, or I'm going to have this like keto thing, or I'm going to do paleo or whatever. But then as you get into it, you really do realize that what you're asking of your client, what you're asking of yourself, if you're the one who's going to be going through this, is that there are hundreds of micro decisions that are changing. So that client may need to start shopping at a new grocery store. They may need to learn new cooking skills. They may need to learn to cook for themselves for the first time, or maybe before it was just, all Uber Eats or some like food delivery service, right? So really understanding the mental piece to the outcome that you're chasing, I think is so important. And when in the context of, I think this is true for men and women, and I can only speak to my experience as a woman and, what a lot of women have confided in me, we tend to beat ourselves up a lot. Like we tend to start a lot of diets, start a lot of programs. And then if that program doesn't tailor to our menstrual cycle, if we're in our reproductive years, or when we are menopausal, and we can't, carry on with it for whatever reason, we blame ourselves. We say, oh, there's something wrong with me. My willpower, I'm broken, I'm this, I'm that. And what I would love, either through this book or just through my career, is to allow for women to really cut those energetic cords of the shame and the guilt that we automatically jump to something is wrong with us. And sometimes it's a matter of just changing our belief systems and the way that we interact in our world, that it's going to be far more impactful than any squat, new technique, pistol squat. Like it doesn't matter, what you're doing in the gym. You have to really come from a place of nourishment and love and grace and ease.
And it's quite an interesting subject, and particularly in terms of, well, how do you explain what that means? Because if you want to get fit, it's like, okay, well, let's book a trainer, let's go to a gym, and I'm going to do it 3 times a week for 45 minutes or what have you. If you look at, let's say, brain health, how does that fit into your schedule? Is it something that you have to arrange some time with one of your coaches or yourself, the same 3 to 5 times a week for 45 minutes to work on that? Is it something that you just fit in, I suppose, without having a direction of, or how do I work on this and acknowledge the importance of that? It can be quite confusing about where to start in order to make progress.
Yeah, I think that this is a great question. And, I understand that. And even, when I would have a new patient in the clinic, I wouldn't be like, so tell me how you feel about yourself, but like for real, you don't jump there first, right? There's a certain amount of rapport building that has to happen. I think for, whether you are doing the work yourself or you're coaching someone through it, I think that there are a couple of different avenues that we know, based on the literature, that have been shown to be effective when they're applied consistently over time. The first, is exercise, right? So we know that moving your body, like there's really no distinction when we think about neurological health, when we're thinking about promoting healthy brain aging. Your body and your brain are not two distinct entities. Sure, there's, we have a blood-brain barrier, there's a different immune system, there's these like protected areas of the body, but it's the same thing. So just by virtue of helping your client or you yourself moving more often, and whether that is specific movement in the gym, more what I would call more specialized movement, or if it's more of a general type of movement, more of what your personal trainers or your physiotherapists or your chiropractors might call NEAT movement, so non-exercise activity thermogenesis, where you are walking, where you're gardening, where you're puttering around the kitchen. Those are so important for optimizing for brain health, because what you're doing, of course, through any type of movement is you are activating the motor cortex. So whenever you're moving, we have sensory afferents, or information coming up from the body into the brain, into the sensory cortex. And then we have motor efferents. So there's like signals that are coming down from the brain that go into the body. So the motor cortex is located in the frontal lobe, which is kind of the front area of the brain. And just by virtue of, going to the gym or just going for a walk in the morning, you're going to be increasing the blood flow and increasing the activity to your frontal lobe. And why that's important is the frontal lobe is essential for emotional regulation. It's essential for, strategy and long-term decisions and thinking about the future. And one of the things I don't think is spoken, we often talk about like the prefrontal cortex and activating the prefrontal cortex, and all that is really, really important. But one of the main jobs of the brain, one of the main jobs of that higher center, that frontal lobe, is an inhibitory one. And what that means is that your frontal lobe is designed to inhibit lower brain centers, like areas, for example, the limbic system or the amygdala, which is really involved in like threat detection. So the stronger that your frontal lobe is, and you strengthen it through movement, like the specialized movement or the NEAT type of movement, is going to strengthen your mental resilience and your mental capacity vis-a-vis a higher activation of the frontal cortex. Another thing that we know that's really important for mental health or brain health is getting quiet. And this is hard. This is a hard, like, it's so easy to be like, you all should meditate, but it's so hard to do that, especially when we are bombarded with, our emails are dinging, the Slack, I have like a Slack. Just before we got on here, I had to close off my Slack, which is like basically an instant messaging thing for me and my team. And my phone is on airplane mode. There's all these signals for us to be thinking outside of our body. But if you can find a way to get quiet and just listen to, sometimes the racing thoughts, sometimes the negative thoughts, just the thoughts, the things that are being an observer of the mental space that you're currently occupying. I think is really important. It's so easy for us men and women to just, what I like to call like living throat up, right? It's like, we just want to live in the algorithmic, logical, kind of, being very much in our brain and being very much reactive. But if you can just kind of sink a little bit below the throat and into your heart space, into your womb space, into your body, and just check in with what your body is telling you, I think that is also a form of meditation. So there's, meditation is sort of it can be a bit of a nebulous term, right? It can mean like a lot of, there's a lot of different definitions, but I would say like focusing on your breath and or focusing on your body and getting quiet. I think these have been really shown to up level that frontal lobe strength, which is, to your question around how can we improve our brain health? Those would be my 1-2 punches, if you will. And if there's a third, I would say structuring your morning and your evening in a way that sets you up for success. Checking your phone, the beginning, the first thing, if you're doing that in the beginning of the morning, you're already in reactive mode, right? So trying to set up your day like a champion. Like if you were, I always will tell myself this, I tell this to my clients. If you had, if you were a multimillionaire, like, would you be jumping on Instagram to check out the news or the latest fight or the latest, like, you wouldn't, right? You'd have other shit that you'd have to, I'm sorry if I don't know if we're allowed to swear, pardon me. Other stuff that you'd be concerned with, taking care of your company and the people that you serve, right? And in the same way, you don't have to be a millionaire to think like that. You can be thinking about, okay, I have people that I'm responsible to today. Myself, my team, my family. How am I going to start this morning in a way that serves my higher purpose, the reason why I'm here?
Right. One of the things that I've seen you talk about is the differences between men and women, and I guess when people set off on particularly if you are a couple, when you set about on a journey of fitness, it helps if you're doing it together. I think so. I think people sort of acknowledge that, but from learning from you, there's also quite a number of differences. You mentioned it earlier on in the interview, and I also heard you talk. We're talking about the brain. I also heard that there's a difference in how the brains are set up between men and women as well. So I just wanted you to sort of talk a little bit about those key differences in terms of if you are trying to do this together, so that I suppose one of you is not necessarily getting deflated, that progress isn't being made as it should do. What are some of those key things that I suppose the men that are listening need to be aware of for their partner and vice versa?
Yeah, I would. This is a great question because I agree with you. I think that accountability, if you are, if you're in a couple, whatever that couple looks like, right? We want to be supportive of each other, and we want to be celebrating wins. And when there's going to be failures, which there always will be, you want to have the tools in the toolbox to be able to navigate through that. So, a couple of things that I would highlight from the beginning, especially if we're talking about like more of a heterosexual couple, right, with a man, a male, and a female. Women are just generally more defensive of their fat stores. So men can get shredded relatively easily. There's a couple of reasons for that. They just naturally have more testosterone, and testosterone is a sex hormone that's involved in lean muscle mass. It's involved in energy. It's involved in quelling anxiety. It's involved in all of these different things. So there's orders of magnitude, like 10 to 20x. There's like a 10 to 20x difference between men and women in terms of our testosterone concentrations. And there's also a couple of other metabolic hormones that I would highlight. Just to be aware of. One of them is leptin. So leptin is the hormone that tells you to put the fork down, right? So if you are, if you're having dinner and you've had enough calories, and actually there's some really cool research that talks about some other hormones like CCK that we're basically just foraging for, a certain amount of fat, a certain amount of amino acids. And once that threshold is reached, then we'll start to see some of these satiety hormones like CCK and leptin being released. But with leptin in particular, leptin is different in terms of, for women, we have a bit of a different scenario. And what I mean by that is, for any given measure of BMI, women tend to be more leptin resistant than our male counterparts. And what that means is that your leptin, which is secreted from your fat cells. So when you've had enough food, leptin, normally what should happen is leptin is secreted. It's picked up by some of the appetite regulation centers in the brain. And then leptin, then you don't feel hungry anymore. You put the fork down, as I said before. But for women, we can be leptin resistant. So for whatever reason, leptin can be released from the adipocyte, and then it's not picked up from the appetite center in the brain in the same way that we might see in our male counterparts. And so what happens, of course, is that the woman doesn't feel the need to put the fork down. She still feels hungry. So
I get that sometimes.
We all get it. We all get it, right? And especially when it's like there's like a lot of pleasure in the food, and it's like a celebratory event. Like, we all are there. But I think it's important for men and women to really understand that we tend to consume. There is a tendency for women to consume more calories. Now, it's not a hard and fast rule for everyone. I'm sort of painting a bit of broad, paint brushstrokes here. But there's a general tendency for women to be more leptin resistant. So our hunger and satiety signals are a little bit stronger. And there's a couple of reasons for that. If you are a woman who's in her reproductive years, you need to have a certain amount of fat in order for your body to feel like it is safe to ovulate. Whether or not you want children, different conversation, right? But your biology is going to push forward so that every month you ovulate so that you can have the opportunity to have a baby. And if your body fat is too low, you're not going to ovulate because your body will sense, your mitochondria and your ovaries will sense this is a dangerous environment for us to get pregnant. So we're not going to ovulate this month. So that's sort of like a hormonal, back of the envelope, like two things to really keep in mind. I would also say that, if you're working out together, or you're following a nutrition program together, also know that her hormonal landscape is going to change so that through her menstrual cycle, there's going to be times in her exercise regime that she should be really trying to lift heavy weights. Usually it's in like the first half of the cycle. And if we can even pinpoint it a little further, like in that pre-ovulatory week, so that second week in her cycle, that's when a woman's testosterone peaks. So she has a certain amount of testosterone through the month. It has a bit of a pattern, but it will peak in that second week. And so you'll find that this is I will often counsel women and say, this is a great time. If you're working out with your partner, get him to spot you, like do the 5 rep do like maximum 8 reps. Like you should need a spotter for those last 2 to 3 reps because it's so heavy. And that's going to profit off of your peaking testosterone during that time. And also, interestingly, in that week, that's also a terrible time for you to do high intensity interval training as a female. Because we see, so the other thing that peaks in that week, it's kind of a peak week, if you will, for my bodybuilders out there who know what that means. Estrogen also peaks that week. And estrogen is another anabolic hormone. It's another trophic hormone. But what we know about estrogen's effects on the MSK, on the musculoskeletal system, is that it makes our ligaments very loose and it makes our tendons stiffer. So if you are engaging in burst like training, so you are sprinting or, you're on a bike and you're, doing max cadence or something, your tendons, in the knee joint or any joint that's being stressed is much more loosey-goosey. So that explosive movement is not ideal during that time. So you actually want to favor those heavy weights. And in fact, because your tendons are a little stiffer, you can handle the heavier weights better than you can at any other time in the cycle. So there's times in the cycle that a woman should be modifying how she's lifting. I think she should be lifting all through the cycle. Like I'm a really big fan of resistance training for women, irrespective of age, really. Like all through our lives, we should be trying to be strong. I often will kind of jokingly say like, I have, 3 children now and I'm training to be like the favorite grandmother. Like I want to be able to lift my grandbabies up. I want to be able to run after them. I want to be able to, when we're traveling again freely, I want to be able to lift up my, luggage and put it in the overhead compartment without asking anybody for help. Right. So exercise, couple of things to note there. And then nutrition would be another. So one of the mistakes that I made, and I wrote about this in the Betty Body in the book, was that I used to try to white knuckle my way, like all month long, I would try to eat the same way. And I would do pretty well until like week 2 or 3. And then that week before my period, and many women who are listening to this, hopefully it's not just me. I'm not just an N of one, but like, you get all the cravings, you want all the chocolate, you want all the food. And that's because if I were to do a blood draw in that week, we would see things like lowered plasma glucose, lowered plasma amino acids, lower plasma free fatty acids, lower glutathione, lower vitamin D, lower selenium, lower zinc, all of these micronutrients and these macronutrients are literally being thrown into the endometrial lining to build it out in, preparation for receiving a fertilized egg. So it's important for a woman to have a bit of a diet break that week. So to increase her calories, if she's practicing any type of intermittent fasting, to extend that window so that she has a longer feeding window. Because it's her biology requires it. And if you try to muscle against your hormones, I promise you'll lose every time because they are powerful. They are powerful little things. And you may have all the willpower in the world, which is amazing, but your hormones will always get what they want.
Thank you for supporting the Escape Your Limits podcast. If you're thinking about creating a unique and engaging fitness space to take your fitness to the next level, then we have you covered. Escape Fitness design and manufacture some of the most innovative, attractive, and durable functional training and free weight equipment used by many of the best trainers and fitness brands across the globe. As a valued listener, we are offering you a 10% discount off many of the products on our website. You can check out the full range by going to escapefitness.com and use the code dumbbell. That's escapefitness.com using the code dumbbell. That's it from me. Please enjoy the rest of this interview.
So coming on to diet, which you just mentioned, one of the things that you seem to talk about quite a bit is keto, and the more I've listened to some of your work, the more I've sort of realized I didn't know as much as I thought about keto. What would be interesting is if you could just talk about, what is keto? How do you define keto, and why is it something that you are probably fond of as a type of a diet?
Yeah, I look at keto as a tool. So, and there's many ways to do a ketogenic diet. There are ways that you can nuance and program the macronutrients and the substances that you're consuming to fit what I would call a more female-centric approach to a ketogenic diet. So a ketogenic diet is like the way I would define it is it's a high fat, moderate protein, and low carbohydrate, and in some cases, no carbohydrate diet. And I say that because and I didn't write about this in the book, but I will say that clinically, when I've worked with a lot of women, we have a higher propensity for autoimmune issues. So like Hashimoto's thyroiditis, multiple sclerosis. There's often, without going down that whole rabbit hole, they often will respond to a more aggressive type of keto, which, you may have heard of as like more of a carnivore type of diet where they're eating more nose to tail and not so much of the green leafy vegetables because they have some gut dysbiosis and hyperpermeability and co-infections in the gut that need to be cleared out. But that sort of cohort aside, for most women, I would say that, about 70% fat, 20% protein, 10% carbohydrate, macronutrient split is what I really like. And within the carbohydrates, it's not like, it's not just like, ice cream and whatever. It's like, it's green leafy vegetables. It's a lot of greens. So when you think about building your plate, if you sort of were to look at, your plate from a bird's eye view, you might say, there's a bed of vegetables, hopefully there's some from the brassica genus, like we're seeing some of the broccoli and we're seeing some of the Brussels sprouts and some of those sulforaphane containing green vegetables. You have about, a palm size portion of protein and then, the fat as the fill. And that's some olive oil, maybe that's some sort of, vinaigrette that you've created.
And with the protein, just whilst you mentioned that, like what as you mentioned it in terms of size, what would that be in terms of a gram equivalent of protein? Like my wife doesn't eat meat, and she's I guess you'd call her a veggie. But if you're supplementing protein or something, what would that be in terms of grams?
Well, I guess it would depend on the caloric intake that you're taking in, but anywhere I would say at a minimum of like 1.8 grams per kilogram of body weight up to, depending on your goals, you might bring it up all the way up to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight.
Okay.
Yeah.
And with keto then, what are some of the, I suppose, lessons or I guess, recommendations to be able to play the long game with keto, to be able to sort of make it, just part of what you do, every day over an extended period of time, or would you suggest that you don't do it over an extended period?
Oh, that's a great question, actually. I would say that my philosophy around keto is a little different for men and women. So for women, I don't think that a woman should be in ketosis forever. I think that there's a time and a place for a therapeutic intervention of keto. And the reason why that is most of us, when we think about, the North American, any Western, most of Europe now, and you can even make an argument for, Asia as well, like this Western standard American diet is a lot of processed foods. It's a lot of simple carbohydrates. It's a lot of unhealthy fats, like a lot of trans fats. And I think that when we're thinking about this for women, we want to be I always want to play the long game, right? Like there's absolutely no point in starting something and just to be able to do it for a month so that you can lose, 5 pounds or whatever. Like I want to be able to do something that's going to fit my lifestyle and it's consistently, like you can consistently apply the tool over time. So for women, I actually like to cycle the keto. So I don't think you should be in ketosis forever. There's a therapeutic intervention, like a therapeutic window, and that might be a month for some women. It might be 3 months, depending on, and then we move into sort of the autoimmune spectrum where we might have her longer. And then once we start to see some of those parameters improve, so whether it's weight loss or it's gut health or it's mental clarity, a lot of women, particularly in perimenopause, will start to complain about sleep issues and brain fog. Once we start to see those symptoms clearing, then I like to bring her into more of a cyclical approach. So this is where we are going 1 week on keto and then 1 week off. And I also like to pair that if she's in her perimenopausal or younger, with her menstrual cycle. And those off weeks are also really important as well. So I like for a woman, again, kind of pulling in my exercise background, I like her to be consuming a higher protein and a higher carbohydrate diet on those 2 alternate weeks. And the reason for that, as many of your listeners will know, is the more protein that you consume, of course, this is going to drive something called muscle protein synthesis, which is just what it sounds like. You're creating new muscle proteins. And this is really important for women as they're leading up to menopause, and then even more important beyond it. So we want to be putting on as much lean muscle mass while we still have those cycling trophic hormones, the estrogen and the testosterone that are still cycling, so that we can lift heavy those weeks that we have more testosterone and more estrogen, and we consume more protein and carbohydrates there as well. And I think with carbohydrates as well, I think in the keto community, this is where I tend to be like a bit of a dark swan or whatever the thing is, because there's so many people that are so literally terrified of ever consuming a carbohydrate. And I completely disregard that. I think that carbohydrates are really, really important, especially when you're strategic about them. You pair them with a protein, so you're getting that insulinergic, kind of bump, which is also, insulin is an anabolic hormone, helps with muscle growth as well. So I like to cycle high protein, high carb with moderate protein, low carb. So it's sort of like keto week and then high protein week, keto week and then high protein week. And I think that that's how you do it long term. When you are as a woman, if you are constantly consuming low carbohydrates, we're going to start to see it eventually affect her sleep. We talked about earlier at more at the top of the hour how women are a bit more defensive of their fat stores. So if you have depleted all of your glycogen, now your body has to go into your adipose tissue and take the triglyceride and make use of it. But if you start taking too much of that, your body's gonna be like, no. We're going to shut this down because we need to be able to ovulate. Let's go into her muscle stores. Let's take some of her muscle and use some of those as fuel. And you'll actually find women as they kind of get into that last 5 to 10 pounds of especially if they're thinking about weight loss, it's much more important to be consuming, more of the carbohydrate and the protein composition in the diet so that you can spare the muscle, right? You want to always spare the muscle. You never want to use that hard-earned muscle for fuel. Mm-hmm. So those are how I would structure the long-term application for a ketogenic diet for a woman. And for a man, I think, I don't have as much experience, but what I can see from both the literature and from, men that I know that do keto is they can legit be on keto for years, and we have carnivore MD, like Paul Saladino, and we have the Sean Bakers and all those, sort of, more carnivore leaning experts who like to stay in keto and like to eat that way over a long delta, over a long period of time. So I would say, there's always some bio-individuality to this. This is not everyone should do exactly this, but I would say in general, women need to be cycling their keto, matching it up with their menstrual cycle over the long term so that they can, profit from both growth phases and recovery phases as well.
Right. One of the things I thought was interesting is I believe it's in your book, and you were talking about cravings, and I hadn't heard it before, but you talk about something called resistant starches and,
yes,
and how important they are. Could you sort of tell us a little bit about that?
It's can I just say, it's so lovely to speak to someone who's read the book. It's so obvious that you've read the, thank you so much. Yes. So resistant starches are also one of the keys when we think about structuring a ketogenic diet over the long term. So what is a resistant starch? When you think about the word, it's a starch that resists digestion. So that's what happens. Most of the absorption, any food that we eat, most of it is assimilated in the small intestine. Well, a resistant starch doesn't do that. So the resistant starch, the carbon chain is too long for the small intestine to break it down. So it'll pass through relatively undigested and into the large intestine. And another word for a resistant starch is a prebiotic. So you may have heard of a prebiotic. Those names are we're talking about the same type of compounds. So once the resistant starch or the prebiotic makes its way to the large intestine, it can now serve as a food source for the microbiome in the large intestine. And this is really important. So the microbiome kind of chows down on it. They will release short chain fatty acids, one of them being butyrate. And butyrate is a really important short chain fatty acid, not only for helping to heal the gut, because we know that it helps with hyperpermeability of the gut, helps with sleep. I always like butyrate for beauty sleep, but it also helps with cravings. And this is if you're listening and you're like, I tried keto, kind of did it for a couple of weeks and then like couldn't deal with it anymore. A lot of women will report around that 2 to 3 week mark of doing keto that it doesn't matter how much fat that they have, all they want is pizza. Like all they want is like a piece of bread and a muffin, and they want to throw the keto diet, kick it to the curb. And part of the reason for that is that the microbiome, the large intestine, is starving, and it is sending an emergency signal up to the brain, up to those appetite regulation centers, and it's making you think about is consuming a carbohydrate. So when you have these resistant starches, you can quell the cravings on a ketogenic diet. And that's something that I think is important both for men and women, but in particular for women, because our hunger and satiety signals are so much more delicate. They can be thrown off with just the slightest change of macronutrient composition or fasting or excess exercise or what have you. So I will usually have a woman start taking resistant starches, in particular in week 3 and 4 of her cycle. So after she's ovulated, now we move into sort of this luteal phase of the cycle. And this is where if a woman is going to experience general cravings, if she's going to experience the premenstrual type of, the classic like craving, wanting the chocolate, moodiness, irritability, sleep disturbances, bloating, gut distension, the resistant starches in this week 3 and 4 will be so well received in helping to ameliorate and to tampen that down.
Right. And what are some of the examples? What are some good resistant starches then?
Well, I like to buy them in powder form, but you can have like a green banana powder or its cousin plantain. Like you can have a green plantain flour. Even if you just look at a banana, right? If you were to go to the store and buy a bunch of bananas and they're green, if you were to eat that, it's not quite as sweet as if you were to let it ripen on the counter and allow it to turn yellow. And then if you leave it too long, it turns into like, you get the brown spots and stuff. What that process is actually telling you is it's moving from a resistant starch to more sugar. Like those carbon chains are getting shorter and shorter. So those would be some really great examples. Another couple of great examples are cold potatoes and cold rice. So a nice hack or a nice, trick that you can try is to make, white rice as you normally would. And then instead of consuming it when it's hot, pop it in the fridge and then let it cool down. And what happens is in the process of cooking, like if, we would never have a raw potato. And this is also true for potatoes, by the way, cooking it and then putting it in the fridge. You would never have a raw, it doesn't taste that great. Same with rice. It's like too, tough. But through the process of heat, now we're breaking those resistant starches into these smaller carbon chains. And then when we take the potato or the rice and we put it in the fridge, now we're seeing this crystallization or this gelatinization of those carbon chains. So you get that resistant starch content back again. So a little, if you want like a little, keto snack, sometimes I'll have like, rice, heat it up, put it in the fridge overnight, and then you can pull it out, a little bit of, sea salt, a little bit of olive oil, and it's a nice little snack.
Interesting. So what about fasting? What's your thoughts on that? And if so, how do you fit that into a diet? I've tried it a number of times with different kind of versions, but have you found something? One, do you think it has a place? And two, what have you found as being sort of like, a good way of including into your life?
I think fasting is absolutely a wonderful tool for everybody. I think the application of the fasting really matters. So in the book, I talk about 3 levers, if you will. When we're thinking about putting together a fasting protocol for someone. There's the type of fast that you can do, right? So are you just consuming water, or are you consuming more of a, you doing like a caloric restriction, or more of a, a mimetic type of diet? You can do the length of time. So that's another lever that you can pull. Like, how long is the fast? Is it a day? Is it 12 hours? Is it 4 days? So time, type, and then the other lever that you can think about is frequency. Like, how often do you do a fast? So you can, with those 3 levers to pull and manipulate, there's a lot of different combinations of fasting. I think when we think about anyone who is thinking about weight loss, a lot of people come to me for weight loss concerns or improving their hormones. I think that the gentler the fast, the better. So I think what tends to happen is we get really excited, just like with, new shiny blinky object. We're like, oh, I'm going to fast. I can do it for 24 hours. And like, they kind of just jump right into this new tool. And probably anyone can, fast for 24 hours. But if you haven't built up any tolerance to it, it's really going to suck. Like, it's really going to be painful. And then the likelihood of you coming back and returning to that practice again in the future is now attenuated, right? Because now you're like, wow, that was a really painful experience. I don't want to do it again. So just like I wouldn't, if you started working with me and you've never, run before, I wouldn't sign you up for a marathon. Like, it's the same with fasting. We want to increase the tolerance and the neurological capacity for someone to fast. And fasting is, it's an interplay of the endocrine system and the neurological system. So we want to be thinking about disrupting some of our hunger signals. If you are someone who eats at the same time let's say you eat at 8 in the morning and then you eat again right at 12, then you eat right again at 4 or whatever. You have, hormones in your body, namely one of them being ghrelin, that's going to start contracting the muscles of the stomach so that you're starting to get that grumbling, and you're going to start thinking about food around the same time every day. Mm-hmm. Well, one of the beautiful things about fasting is that it can completely disrupt that, right? So you can keep your ghrelin system guessing by changing how you fast. And as I mentioned, I like to start off really gently and then increase a person's tolerance over time. So how that might look, in a practical setting or a practical tool or application would be, starting someone off at a 12-12. So what that means is a 12-hour fasting window, and most of that's your sleep, right? So hopefully you're sleeping for 7, 8 hours out of that 12, right? And then you have a 12-hour eating window. So maybe you start eating at 7 in the morning, you have a cup of coffee or whatever you're having. And then you have until 7 at night, very easy to do. Most people can start off with that with absolutely no issue. And then, depending on, the hormonal composition, if it's a woman who, let's say, has PCOS, which is, multifactorial, but we see a lot of like hyperandrogenism, like too much testosterone, too much insulin. We might be more aggressive in the way that we approach her fasting. So we might have her do several longer fasts, like a 16-8 or a 24-hour or a 36-hour fast, several times a week, and then pair that with like another 12-12. So she might do like an OMAD, like a 24-hour on Monday, let's say. She eats Tuesday evening, and then she'll have a 12-12 the next day, right? So she'll do it, she'll eat again at 7 in the morning on Wednesday, and then she eats until 7 p.m. on Wednesday evening. So lots of different ways to put fasting in. I think it's a really important tool. It's free, right? It's diet agnostic. So you can be doing keto, you can be doing paleo, you can be vegan, you can do whatever. It can fit into any type of diet regimen. And I think that it's also, I think it's important to rest, especially if one of the goals is gut, helping with the gut, helping with the integrity of the gut, allowing for the repair of the gut, I think is really, really important. And there's always seems to be like a feeding, like a celebratory, like there's times for, we have, national holidays, and we have, for my North Americans who are listening, we have like Thanksgiving, and then there's Christmas, and then there's Easter if you're celebrating Easter. There's all these things throughout the year where there's these big events where there's a feast, but what's often missing is the yin to that yang, right? Which is the fasting. So you can feast and fast. Like you don't have to go into, a lot of times around the holidays, particularly December, sort of November, December, when, Canadians and, Americans are thinking about Thanksgiving and they're thinking about Christmas. They're all worried about the holiday parties and they're worried about, putting on weight through the Christmas holidays. But all you have to do is just throw in a fast, either right before or right after, you're going to have a big meal, like Christmas dinner, and you're good, right? And then we, again, cut those energetic cords of shame and guilt, and I have no willpower, and you can actually allow yourself to enjoy, a meal with your family or a meal with whoever you deem important to spend your time with. So all that to say, I know that's a bit of a long answer, but I do think that fasting is really, really important, but we want to be smart about how we apply it. And I think for women who are much more sensitive to these hunger regulation, like this sort of appetite, hunger and satiety signals, we want to be gentler with women in general.
And in terms of fasting, is there a sort of a technical definition? Can it only be water? Does it, or does it exclude water, or can you have like any kind of other liquids? What's a sort of like a main, if people just say, well, I want to try that, whether it's the 12-12 or the 24-hour, are there any sort of like key rules that classify as a fast?
Well, I think it depends on who you ask. If you ask me, I think that there's different ways to fast. So in the book, I talk about a non-caloric liquid fast, which is what you were just talking about, which is like the water, the coffee, the herbal tea. And most fasting purists, right, will say that's the only, there's also dry fasting as well. Like we see religious dry fasting as well. But I would say that for most people, when they think of fasting, they think of that non-caloric liquid fast. I also define caloric liquid fast. So you are consuming some calories, maybe in the form of soup or bone broth. Those are also really great for people with digestive troubles, because you're consuming a lot of, usually it's glycine, and there's glycosaminoglycans in the bone broth. You're consuming the collagen, all of these things that are really helpful for the epithelial lining of the stomach, which has of the gut, which has a really quick turnover as well. So a caloric liquid fast would be like having some soup, some bone broth, where it's more of a caloric restrictive model. Like you're still not having the same amount of you're not having the calories that you would on a normal feeding day, but you're taking it in liquid form, which is much easier for your body to assimilate the proteins and the goodness that's in there. So I would I have two of those like main categories, non-caloric and caloric. And then you can also play with fasting mimetics. So, technically the ketogenic diet is a bit of a fasting mimetic, because you're restricting a macronutrient. You're restricting one of the three macros, which is carbohydrates in this case. You can also protein restrict. You can flip that completely around, and you can fat restrict. So there's there's fasting mimetics where you can restrict a carbohydrate or just decrease your total caloric intake in more of a calorically restricted model. So I'm much more fluid in my definitions of fasting than, maybe some others, but I think that it's important to be able to nuance that to the different types of people that we're dealing with.
In terms of benefits of fasting, I've picked up, you talked about something called autophagy. Can you sort of expand on what that is?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Autophagy is, I always, whenever I've presented on fasting, I've often talked about thinking about it as Pac-Man, right? So for those of you that, grew up with Pac-Man, who were playing at the arcades, you'll know what I'm talking about. So it's basically, you have, cellular debris, you have pieces of nucleotide, you have, mitochondria that are not functioning as efficiently as they can. You have cells that are not efficient, that are not functioning as efficiently as they can. And in a fasted environment, your body it's actually always happening. It's just amplified in a fasting environment where you will just get rid of the stuff that you don't want. So it's kind of like spring cleaning, right? When you sort of get that itch to go through your closet and say, okay, what are the things I'm not really wearing that's just taking up space here? And so that's amplified in a fasting environment. So when you are fasted, whether that's a 12-hour, and of course, the more that you fast, the more that autophagy is amplified. And at the time of this recording, we don't have a really good way to measure autophagy. It's not like you need to reach a certain amount of this activity per liter of, or, per deciliter of like blood plasma or something. Like there's no standard, but what we do know is that it happens at around it starts happening around that 8 to 9 hour mark. And then the more you fast, the more of it you have. But yeah, autophagy basically cleans up like dead cells, old cells. And then the really nice thing about when you start to eat again is that you can now start to produce, like, let's say you got rid of, mitochondria, for example, that were kind of slow and inefficient. You'll have this mitochondrial biogenesis as well. So creating new mitochondria that are, younger, faster, and more efficient as well.
So in terms of supplementation, and this, I know this is a very broad question because there's a lot of specifics just in terms of men and women, for one, is going to be different, and then breaking that down in terms of where you are. But in general, in your experience, what are some of the things that we should consider in terms of supplementation, in terms of getting the extra nutrients we need in our diet? And maybe you can sort of break that down just into 2 or 3 key ones for men and 2 or 3 key ones for women.
I would say that actually the supplements for men and women would be the same. It's just the manner in which they take them. So women, I like to pulse, I like to cycle their supplements through their menstrual cycle. And men, it would just be more of a consistent application. And so if I could choose, I would say omega-3s, absolutely number one. I know that we hear a lot about, it's important to get our omega-3 to 6 ratios correct, but omega-3s have so much more than meets the eye. So they're anti-inflammatory. They help with depression. They've been shown to help with mood alteration. So for those of us that have a tendency, even if it's cyclically, to have mood or be more irritable or more moody, omega-3s can help with that. They've been shown to actually help regulate hunger, to help reduce or bring down some of our hunger signals. And of course, if you're vain, if you don't care about any of that, then of course it's going to really help you with, beautiful skin, hair, and nails. So if that's not enough of a, if you don't really care about the, the depression and the, all the other positives that it has, it helps you look good. I would say a minimum between a minimum of 2 grams or like 2,000 milligrams of omega-3s a day. And of that, making sure that your EPA is at least 1,000 milligrams. So most, when you sort of look at the 2 different types of omega-3s, the 2 main ones that you'll see in supplement form are DHA and EPA. I would say for any of you that have ever had any brain issues, like if you've had a concussion or you have a TBI or anything like that, you really want to skew more to the DHA because that's really, really been shown to help reduce some of the inflammatory mechanisms that can happen in a traumatic brain injury. But for the rest of us, you want to make sure at least 1,000 milligrams of EPA, and then a total consumption of around 2 to 3 grams. The next one would be vitamin D. Most of us, especially in the past, 18 months, spending a lot of time indoors, a lot of time afraid of whatever. And we want to be really thinking about having adequate levels of vitamin D. So I know we call it a vitamin. It's not really a vitamin. It's actually a hormone. It is part of the birth of our sex hormones. We've been talking a little bit about testosterone and estrogen today. You need vitamin D for that. Also a really potent activator of your immune system. So it helps amplify natural killer cells and your T cells and your lymphocytes. So I would say at a very minimum, like base minimum is like 2,000 international units of vitamin D a day. And then depending on where, you should probably have your vitamin D levels tested. I always recommend that. Ideal range is somewhere, 60 to 80, 85 nanograms per deciliter. But if you are not in that range, you can work with a doctor to help bring you into that optimal range. And for a lot of us that live north, in sort of northern climates, you get all 4 seasons. You get winter. Through the winter, I often will up the supplementation for myself and for my clients that just don't have we just just don't have, no one's going to go out in, freezing weather. So, we supplement with vitamin D there. So we got omegas, we got vitamin D, and then the last one would be magnesium. Magnesium is, I think, involved in 320-ish reactions in the body. Some notable ones obviously are helping with muscle contraction, helping an enzyme called COMT or COMT. This is really important in not only our alertness, but it's also important in our estrogen metabolism and detoxification. So you need magnesium in order for that puppy to run. Generally, I'd say women, because we bleed every month and there's a lot of, like, your body will throw a lot of magnesium into that endometrial lining. If you're not replenishing that, you need to be supplementing with magnesium as well. So those would be like, and then I guess dosage there would be a minimum of 400 milligrams of magnesium. And then for women, and especially if they're having like any PMS type of symptoms, I would be cycling the magnesium so that it's a bit higher in their luteal phase in the second half of their cycle.
So what about recovery? It sounded like when you went on, when you were studying, it was one of the things that you probably wasn't getting enough of. And when we talk about getting in shape, we I guess instantly think about activity, but I know again, after reading some of the stuff that you've been talking about, there's some serious consequences of not getting that right, from sleep to rest, etc. What are some of the sort of key things that we should be aware of in terms of recovery, and I guess sort of habits or rituals that we should be thinking about during our day to sort of optimize that?
I think that one of the things that as you mentioned, I disregarded for many years was how productive resting can be. I think as a dopamine chaser, someone who's always like, after that next hit of like achievement and what have you, taking time to rest is not something that has ever really come very easily to me. So I would work myself until I would fall over. And, if you think about this in a muscular, if you think about this just from the context of muscles, that's when your muscles grow, is when you're like, we all think like, got to go to the gym and beast mode and, I got to get this. And yes, you tear up the muscle in the gym, like you destroy the muscle in the gym, but it's the recovery. It's the time off where your muscles grow. That's where the hypertrophy happens. So rest and recovery, I think, is not something that as a society we really allow ourselves to, it's hard to take time off. I remember seeing a meme, and this is more for, just like a hat tip to, the Europeans that listen. And there was a meme that I saw a couple of weeks ago, it made me laugh. It's like, a European will say, I am, taking 6 weeks off in June, and I'll be back, or July, and I'll be back in September. And, the North American will be like, I'm going in for heart surgery tomorrow, but if you really need me, like just text, I'll find a way, in some ways the Europeans really have it right in terms of honoring rest and recovery, time with people that you love, proper sleep, even though we're starting to see it a little bit eroded. My background is Portuguese and Italian, and it's like the siesta in the afternoon. My ex-husband is Greek, so again, like when we would go to Greece, like no stores you couldn't find a store open at 2 p.m. Like you were, SOL if you were trying to find food or anything at that time. And I think that that's really, really important. And one of the things, that we have this sort of like heroic badge of, I don't know what, in this North American society. We're actually starting to see it bleed into that European sort of mentality, which is really a tragedy. But, it's this like, I'm going to work until I'm dead. Like I'll sleep when I'm dead, like there's so many songs that have that, even in the lyrics, like I'll sleep when I'm dead. And I think that when you think about what happens when you sleep, just from a neurological perspective, right? We have something called maybe some of your listeners have heard of the lymphatic system. In the central nervous system, we have something called the glymphatic system. So it's literally lymphatic with a G in front of it. And what that's doing is it's basically cleaning up some of the debris that has happened through the course of your wakeful hours. So you're getting rid of some of the amyloid plaques. You're getting rid of some of those tangles of neurons. You're getting rid of cells that aren't functioning in the way that they are. And that happens in sleep. It happens, we cycle through these different phases of sleep. There's 4 different phases of sleep, and we will cycle through those 4 all the way through the night. So if you are not getting adequate sleep every night, that's one thing. But then taking time to rest. And so sleep is one piece, and then taking time off from the gym, and then just from life, like from your work, taking time to let pleasure in, I think is something that most women, at least I know, have forgotten how to do. And I've done trainings on getting close to your desires and what brings you pleasure. And you can talk about this in a sexual context, but you can also talk about this in maybe having some flowers near your workspace, or going for a walk in nature, listening to the birds in the morning. Like, these things are really simple ways to allow joy in, and we just resist it. Like, oh, it's not important. Like, I can skip that. It's not as important as me, doing X, Y, and Z, responding to this email, getting this thing done, or what have you. So yeah, I think rest and recovery is really important. It's an art, and there's a lot of science to it as well. And I think we've lost a lot of that in that sort of hustle and which is a word that I can't stand, like this hustle and grind. And it's like, what, I think that there's value in rest. It's a sacred act.
And is there any, in terms of routines, we actually had a sleep doctor on a month or so ago. We was talking about this, but have you found any effective routines to either relax or get yourself to have a good sleep? It's something that I constantly work on, as much as my workouts, I guess, is since I've got this Aura ring, and it's one of the things I'm still trying to master. So I'm just interested in what kind of routines or rituals that you've got, and what have you found that's been successful?
One of the things that have helped me the most with my sleep is light in the morning. So I know that seems a bit counterintuitive because we're talking about sleep and darkness. But if you're able to get exposure to light within the first 30 to 60 minutes of waking, without getting too nerdy, or maybe we can get super nerdy, but when your retina perceives this light, and I don't mean like going into a sunny room in your house. I mean going outside and looking as I don't want you to burn your eyes out, but like getting out into the sunlight. If you can look at the sunlight without sunglasses on. One of the things that we know that it does is the retina will perceive that, sends an electrical signal to an area in the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is the master clock, right? If you've ever read any of Dr. Sachin Panda's work or familiar with his book, great book, it's called The Circadian Code. He talks about the SCN, or the suprachiasmatic nucleus, this master clock in the body. And the SCN basically speaks to every single cell in the body. It's time to wake up. It's time to produce ATP. It's time to get things going. But what it also does is it also sets you up for, there's an internal clock that we have. So there's about 16 hours or so later, if you get that SCN moving, right, you get that SCN kind of going, somewhere between, 13 to 16 hours later, you're going to start to feel really sleepy. So it's a complicated dance of like melatonin and adenosine and all of those different hormones. But one of the best things that you can do to have a great sleep, and it's free, like anyone can do this, is like go out and get some sunlight. A couple other things that I mentioned in the book were around evening rituals. So in the same way that we want to expose our retinas to that bright blue light in the morning, that's the opposite of what we want to do in the evening. So that blue light, what it does is it inhibits, I mentioned very quickly, melatonin, which, you may be familiar with. It's like the hormone of grogginess almost, right? It makes you feel like it's the thing that starts sleep. And when we see blue light in the evening, that will also inhibit melatonin. And that's the exact opposite of what you want in the evening. You want melatonin to start secreting at higher and higher concentrations in the dark, so that, your body is like, okay, it's time to shut down now. And that's when you start to feel like a bit more groggy, and you start to feel a little bit more sleepy. And that's when you want to, retire to bed for the evening. So a hard and fast rule that I often will offer is, 2 to 3 hours, like at least 2 hours before you go to sleep, like no devices, so that's no phones. I know it's hard. I know it's hard. I know it's hard to tell people not to do something. But no phones if you can. Try to limit, your television. I often will close all, like the lights in our home is often, they're closed. So we try to mimic whatever the outside world looks like. We try to mimic that indoors. And of course, if you live in a place that has 4 seasons like I do, that changes right through the year. So in the wintertime, it's kind of dark around 4 p.m., 5 p.m. And we keep all of the lights off in order to try and honor that circadian rhythm. So we'll have things like, we have like candelabras. We'll have like we'll have dinner by candlelight, and it feels, really special for a couple of weeks. And in the summertime, of course, sun, it's longer days, longer sun, and we will, keep the lights on until like 8 p.m., 9 p.m. When we start to see the sun go down. So those are pretty easy. You can also invest in things like blue blocking glasses if you want. But I would say that those are like 2 really great places to start: morning light and no light in the evening.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Sounds, I guess it's quite logical really, but it's one that we probably all do the opposite of really. I've got a couple of questions just to finish. One of them is about sex. But before I do that, I just wanted to ask, if people want to find out a little bit more about you and some of the things you're doing, where can they go, and where can they find your book, etc.?
Yeah, thank you. I would say that the best place is, you can pick up the book. So it's called The Betty Body, A Geeky Goddess's Guide to Intuitive Eating, Balanced Hormones, and Transformative Sex. So you can find that at any online retailer, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Goodreads, all the places. That would be one place. Another place that you can find me is, like you, I have a podcast as well. We were talking about tech before we started, so talking about mics and stuff. So my podcast is called Better with Dr. Stephanie, and we release episodes weekly as well. So those are like the top 2 places that you can find me.
Excellent. So I've listened to a few of your own podcasts, and I know, including what I've read, and we talk about sex and a lot of the things that we've discussed, including sleep and working out and mental health, seem to have a huge impact with it. And although it's probably not something that people talk about a lot, it's probably something that people struggle with on a number of levels, because they've not got all of the other things in place, such as their rest, their sleep, their recovery, etc.
Yeah.
I guess, whether it's male or female, in order to sort of be optimal in terms of your own wellness and health, what are some of the things that you've found are important to prioritize as it relates to getting that balance right in your life?
I'm so happy you asked this question, because I think a lot of people shy away from it, because it was a really big chapter in the book. And what I would absolutely love is, obviously once there's rapport between a patient and a doctor, for us to really be destigmatizing and talking about some of the benefits that having a healthy, active sex life can confer. So when we think about, and specifically, we talk about sex, and orgasming, there's a couple of things that are really important to consider here. One is that you are essentially bathing your brain in all of these neurochemicals that are so positive for you. So you have the dopamine, the expectation, kind of beforehand. And then, afterwards you feel, dopamine and serotonin sort of exist on a kind of a continuum. So we have like the super alert, like really looking forward to something, which is the dopamine. So like maybe that's date night with your partner, or that, you're looking forward to spending time with someone. And then connection, the connection that you experience. And of course, we're assuming that this is all consensual and, done in a safe way. And, it's something that both parties want. But that when you are with someone in a sexual capacity, I mean, this is one of the times where we are the most vulnerable, we are the most open, and to share that experience with someone, to share fluids, like this is such a sacred act. And when we think about the neurotransmitters, like some of the benefits of it, of course, we see floods and floods of oxytocin, in that post-orgasm time, which is going to confer more bonding and more feelings of bliss. It's going to help you feel blissed out. And then that serotonin is going to help you feel like content, right? So where the dopamine is like more of the seeking and the hunting and the getting, the serotonin is like, I'm really happy with where I am right now. I feel really good in my body. I feel really good of where I am. So you're dosing all of these things, the dopamine, the oxytocin, the serotonin, of course, all the endorphins that go with it as well. And then from a physiological standpoint, when you see some of the benefits that having a regular sex life and orgasming, on a regular basis can confer, we see things like lowered heart rate. We see things like improved blood pressure. We see improved respiratory rate. So your breathing will slow down. You're not like breathing from some of these accessory muscles in the upper part of the chest, but your diaphragmatic breathing. We also see things like heart rate variability, which is distinct from heart rate. You mentioned the Oura ring. I'm also wearing one as well. Your heart rate variability is basically a measure of your sympathetic and parasympathetic tone. Now, we haven't mentioned those two terms yet, but those are basically branches of the nervous system. Your sympathetic is your fight, flight, freeze. It's like the stress system. And the parasympathetic is the rest, digest, stay, and play. And your heart rate variability, you want more variability. Like you don't want your heart to beat literally every second on the second. You want there to be some variability there, because that tells you, the heart has these two inputs to it, has sympathetic and parasympathetic. You want those to almost be like competing with each other. So you want that variability in your heart rate. So we see all of these things, and then not even talking about like how, your frontal lobe lights up. We have all like the activation and the connectivity in the brain is amplified as well. So, and like, let's just be on like, engaging, like having sex and this is like part of our human design. Like we are designed to do this, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that it's really important that we start thinking about, teaching our young boys and our young girls, obviously you have to do this in an age appropriate way, but like the sacredness of this act, like how important this actually is. And, I can speak from my own experience. I grew up in a very, grew up Roman Catholic and, going to school, I remember thinking like, oh my God, I can like get into a pool and I can get pregnant. Like I had no idea how my fertility, like no idea about my fertility cycle, no idea about sexuality and sensuality. It was viewed as this thing that was unimportant until you got married. And I think that if we can start having this conversation, not only with ourselves, but, for our children, right? Like to teach them about, the sacredness of this and some of the physiological benefits, to be able to speak to that, I think is really important. So I talk a lot about the different phases of orgasms in the book, to vibrate or not to vibrate for women, and, the use of vibrators, which, big fan, but, you also want to be thinking about how you can, and you don't need to, and I should also just pre-frame and say that you don't need to have a partner for an orgasm, right? You can have sex with yourself. There can be your hands, you can have vibrators, you can have all the toys. So I think that there's really no excuse, if you will, to not be thinking about this as a health practice as well. And in the book, I wrote about, the data, which suggests that around a minimum of once a week, but ideally closer to twice a week in terms of having, regular engaging in that either connection with yourself or connection with your partner is important.
Yeah, I was going to ask that, not to be too prescriptive, but the dosing. So that's about once to twice a week is where you'll get those health benefits. Is that right?
Yeah, as a minimum. Yeah, and then you can just go up from there.
Fantastic. So look, final question then, Stephanie. So Escape Your Limits is about escaping what you've believed is impossible and gone on to make it possible. What would be an example of you escaping your own personal limits?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say that I used to think that my menstrual cycle was punishment for being a woman. Like every month I was like, God damn, I hate this. Like this is the worst. It's getting in the way of, my whatever I'm trying to achieve. And what I was really shocked with was how quickly it can turn around. So I talk about in the book, very early on in the book, how I went to Europe on a family vacation after, a couple of very difficult personal years for me. And within one cycle, I had profound changes. And I would have never thought that that was possible for me. So I think that sometimes, you speak to a lot of, and I speak to a lot of colleagues all about like lots of testing and like this crazy new biohacking tool and this, but sometimes it's honestly about getting to these foundational basics that are available to almost every human, like getting light, eating in a way that nourishes your cells, trying to love yourself like you mean it. I think that these are things that we can return to. And, for me, I was, and I still am sometimes just in awe of what the human body can achieve and can do. So I think for me, escaping my limiting belief around, this menstrual cycle being this curse, and to really going from that to feeling like this is how I feel like a goddess. Like I menstruate like a goddess now, like I look forward to my period. I feel like it's a time for reflection. It's a time for problem solving. And I feel like I would love that for every woman, for them to honor and embrace their unique physiology. And that's been something that I've come to a place of understanding and love as well. Like loving who I am for exactly who I am and exactly how I work and for all the parts that I have. And I think that, when you're in that place of peace, this is how you call in joy, right? So that would be how I would answer that question.
Fantastic. Well, Stephanie, thank you so much for your time. And I'd also recommend, even though the book looks as though it's kind of for girls and it's called The Betty Body, I'd highly recommend any guys that are listening to it to check it out.
You are a Betty. Matthew, you are a Betty as well. This is for everyone. Yeah.
Excellent. So thank you very much for your time, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you did, then please go over to iTunes and subscribe to the Escape Your Limits podcast. Leave a review, leave a comment. It really would help us a lot to continue to keep these going.